Some time ago, I did an experiment playing games on a low-end computer built from about $220 of new components. I really should have picked a better name for that video because a lot of people took that for a serious budget gaming build and... yeah, right, okay. You want to see a budget build? Let's get crazy. I have here a ton of old components, most which were kindly donated by Polka, a fan of the channel from Germany who got most of these from scrapyards for next to nothing. Yep, that's right, most of these are stuff that people were throwing away. I will be experimenting with what I have available to build this. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the Trashtop, a gaming computer built almost entirely from stuff other people were throwing away. Using eBay as a point of reference for component prices, I'm going to limit myself to a budget of 120 euros, or the price of 2 AAA games at release, and then I'm going to game on it. Let's begin. For the motherboard, I will be using a GA-P35DS4 from Gigabyte. This old motherboard only supports DDR2 and uses the classic Intel LGA775 socket, which started becoming common around 2006, and that remained in use until the introduction of the 1156, the socket used by the very first generation of i3s, i5s, and i7 CPUs. I saw this motherboard going around eBay for around 45 euros. For the actual CPU, I picked an Intel Pentium dual-core E5800. With only 2 cores, it might give us some issues later on, but the CPU comes clocked at a very high 3.2 GHz, which is surprising for a CPU of this socket. Since LGA 775 CPUs are considered pretty old by today's standards, they're very easy to find at bargain prices. I saw this guy going around for 13 euros and sometimes as low as 7. For RAM, our chosen motherboard only supports DDR2, so I'm going to go with 2 sticks of 2 GB of DDR2 RAM at 800 MHz, for a total of 4 GB of RAM. Being limited to DDR2 means RAM is going to be slow as heck, which will affect loading times and may cause some short freezes, but the advantage is that DDR2 is so old that their price does not seem to be affected by whatever craziness is going on with RAM at the moment. I saw them around for lower than 5 euros each stick. For the video card, I decided to go with a GTX 260, which was donated by longtime viewer and friend Brent last time I was on BitCon US. This was a high-end GPU in 2008. Fun fact, back in that year the GTX 280 was almost the best GPU you could get. When they manufacture the 280's core chip, they will test for defects, and if the chip failed to perform as good as it should, it will be reworked as a 260 chip. So, the GPU is almost like a GTX 280 that did not make it. Cool, huh? The main disadvantage is that this is from a time before DirectX 11 existed, so we will be limited in terms of what games we can test. The advantage is that for games running on DirectX 10 or lower, this is a pretty powerful GPU, but old enough that you can find them for as low as 20 euros. For storage, I will be using a very cheap 320 gig hard drive. It's too slow for Windows 10 but good enough for Windows 7, and you can hunt one of these down for as low as 10 euros. According to some online tools, these will all need around 300 watts of power or more. I'll be using a 500 watt power supply that a friend was going to throw away along with some other components. You can find 500 watt power sources for lower than 20 euros if you search for a cheap one. Fire extinguisher is not included. Finally, to wrap this all up, I'm going to use a case that was thrown away along with the power supply. It's heavy as heck, missing parts and falling apart, but it will do. Which comes to a total of around 120 euros. Now that is budgeting. However, can you really call this a gaming computer? Can you truly game on it? How is the experience? For experimentation, I started with the Csgo Benchmark, lowest settings, 720p, and the configuration file from my Intel HD video. Interestingly enough, both the CPU and the GPU seem to manage to keep up, only struggling when there's a lot of characters or going through smoke, but at least maintaining a playable frame rate. Actual gameplay was good, maintaining something between 50 and 60 FPS on basic matches, which is much better than what I have seen on many previous videos. It's a good start. What about Skyrim? the single-player game that also never stops being popular. This setup did fantastically well on the lowest settings and as high as 1080p. I did not need to fiddle with the configuration files at all to achieve almost perfect frame rate even while in combat. As you have probably noticed, the CPU is quickly becoming the limiting factor in our performance, and you can see the most important drops while loading new areas, but there's still plenty of space to even raise some of the settings before hitting a bottleneck. Going back to multiplayer, I wanted to try Rocket League on the lowest settings and also a resolution of 1080. Even on large matches with a lot going on, the Trashtop was able to keep things going over 60 FPS at all times. An unlocked frame rate meant that the CPU was the main limiter. If you raise the settings a little bit, you start to notice micro freezes when the processor has a hard time keeping up. But if the FPS is limited to 60, the game will perform very well and you can likely increase the settings a bit more. Not bad so far. If you were looking for the cheap way of playing Skyrim, Csgo and Rocket League, this will be a fine way to do so. Let's move up the ladder a little bit. Let's try Bioshock Infinite with the lowest settings and 720p. The included benchmark tool exceeded my expectations by performing consistently over 60 FPS on a variety of environments. This time we finally start seeing the GPU working hard along with the CPU, but given how high the frame rate is, I was curious to see if the Trashtop could handle this game at 1080. While this still did well in general, I did observe a fair amount of freezes and stuttering during combat. Since I did a video for this game that explores just how low you can go by changing configuration files, I was curious to see if this will help at all in this configuration. And sure enough, on the absolute lowest, there were still some slowdowns, but nothing dramatic enough to hinder playability. You don't have to go to these extremes, but with some changes to configuration files and such, there is plenty that you can get out of this computer. Out of curiosity, I decided to try the GTA 5 benchmark on the lowest settings, 720p, shadows disabled by configuration file and limited to 30 FPS. While it originally seemed like it could almost maintain that playable performance, problems started showing out later when large parts of the map needed to be loaded. On one side, the CPU was definitely beginning to show its age, but you can also notice how the game was quickly taking over all the available RAM, which was probably one of the major causes of performance problems on the later parts of the benchmark. I wonder how I will do with a bit more RAM. Well, you will find out soon enough, because this is not the end. On the next episode of the Trashtop, I plan to experiment with this computer further, adding more RAM, maybe changing or overclocking the CPU, and maybe changing the GPU for something capable of playing modern DirectX 11 games. If you liked this video, let me know so I can make more, and consider subscribing so you know when the next one releases. Thank you if you're among the people donated in Patreon, which helps keeps this content going.